Hello, Mr. Mysterious fans. I hope you're ready for another chilling journey into the world of horror and the unexplained. Before we dive into today's story, I have a special request for all of you. I love sharing these spine-tingling tales with you, but I know many of you out there have your own creepy experiences and horror stories. If you have a story you'd like to share and be a part of this amazing community, I would love to hear from you. You can submit your written stories, or even better, record a voice note or audio recording using your phone's recording feature. Just make sure the voice is clear and there's no background noise so everyone can fully enjoy your story. Who knows? Your tale might be the next one featured on this channel. To submit your stories, simply send them to the email address mentioned in the description below. If you want to support this channel, the best way is by liking, subscribing, and commenting. It's your support that motivates me to keep making these stories. So, let's get interactive. Comment down below with your location, the time you're listening, or even who you're listening with. I love seeing where and how you're enjoying these stories. Now, sit back, relax, and grab your snacks. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, close your eyes. Let's start. While bartending at an old dive bar in Minneapolis, I experienced my most intense ghost encounter yet. It was around 10:30 p.m. earlier this year, and I was closing down the bar. All of the doors were locked, and everyone had left for the night, so I was completely alone in the building. To set the scene, this restaurant has a long bar, and at the end of it is a short hallway. If you take a right, there is a stairway that leads to the creepy basement. If you continue down the hallway going straight, it leads into the kitchen. The bar itself had only one entrance to get behind it, and it was down at the end, closer to the kitchen and stairs. The bar had an old, rustic charm to it. The wooden floors creaked with every step, and the dim lighting gave it a cozy yet eerie atmosphere, especially late at night. There were old pictures and memorabilia from the bar's early days decorating the walls, adding to its historical feel. I always loved that about the place. It had character. However, that night, the bar's charm felt more sinister than inviting. I was behind the bar, making a Spotify cue to begin closing the bar to, and the music was currently quiet enough that I could hear something in the kitchen turn on that wasn't on a second before. At first, I thought that the kitchen staff had snuck back in when I wasn't looking. I turned the corner out of the bar and went back into the kitchen. When I flipped the lights on, I saw that our large dish sink against the opposite wall had been turned on, and cold water was running. This was peculiar since the handle was turned and the sink wasn't on a minute before. I looked around the kitchen, turned the sink back off, flipped the light switch off, and returned behind the bar to continue closing. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the faucet had a loose handle and it turned on by itself. But I knew that didn't make much sense. The handle had to be turned deliberately for the water to come on. I shook off the uneasy feeling and continued with my closing duties, trying to distract myself with mundane tasks like wiping down the counters and putting away the glasses. About 30 seconds to a minute later, I heard the water come back on. This time, my heart raced. I went back into the dark kitchen, and as I approached, I could see the water was gushing from the hand-washing sink right next to the previously mentioned dish sink. The cold water tap was turned on fully at a 90-degree angle. I frantically searched the kitchen, opening cabinets, and even looking under the prep tables, assuming someone was playing a prank on me. But the kitchen was empty. After I realized no one was there, I announced out loud, "Do not do that again." My voice echoed in the empty kitchen, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. The air felt heavy, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I was genuinely scared. I was so spooked, I called a friend and searched the entire building with a chef's knife. Room by room, I checked the basement, storage closets, and even the bathrooms. Each creak and groan of the old building amplified my anxiety, but the search turned up nothing. I was completely alone. I returned to the bar, knife still in hand, and called my friend again, explaining what had happened. They tried to reassure me, suggesting that maybe it was just a plumbing issue or my imagination playing tricks on me. But I knew what I saw. Somehow, I managed to finish closing the bar, all while feeling like I was being watched. Every sound seemed amplified in the empty bar. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, even the faint buzz of the neon sign outside. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something standing there. A few other things have happened since then, on a much smaller scale. Sometimes, I hear footsteps when no one is there, or I find objects moved from where I left them. Once, I heard whispering coming from the basement, but when I checked, it was empty. Each incident leaves me feeling uneasy, but nothing has been as intense as that night with the faucets. I've talked to a few regulars and other staff about my experiences. Some have shared their own eerie encounters, while others just laugh it off. The bar has been around for decades, and it's no secret that old buildings can have their quirks. Still, I can't shake the feeling that there's something more to it. Working at the bar is still something I enjoy, but I'm always a bit on edge, especially when closing alone. I've learned to live with the odd occurrences, but that night remains etched in my memory as the most terrifying experience I've ever had. I, like most of us, had a bad, emotionally dark relationship that took us to places we thought we would never see, both literally and in every other way. Back 20 plus years ago, I left mine at Skid Row in Los Angeles. I will only say that in the end, I wished to find the peace I could not bring her and told her as much. I could only save myself at that point. Years later, she would message me randomly on Facebook, and I ran into her at a supermarket. She was married and doing well at that time. I wished her well and moved on. One day, I started getting messages on Facebook again. Her husband had died, and she was once again out of control and ended up back in Skid Row. By then, I was married and established. I did not want to watch the train wreck unfold again and blocked her. I had been driving Uber for a few years at that point, on and off, and dreaded whenever I would go anywhere near Skid Row. I didn't want the drama of running into her. One night in October, I was trying to fill in a bonus and stayed out late. I ended up in downtown LA near Skid Row. I needed one more ride to meet my quota. My pickup was on 6th Street near San Julian. I noticed that most of the streetlights were off, but I could see a woman waiting at my pickup point. She was in black tights and a black hoodie. When she walked to the car, something was familiar about the way she moved. She opened the door, and I turned to greet her. The first thing I noticed was that my dome light did not turn on when she opened the door. In what little light there was, I could see her face in the hoodie. It was my ex, and my greeting died in my throat. She sat, closed the door, and looked out the window. At this point, I was starting to have doubts that it was her because her face was young, like when I first met her, not tired like the last post I had seen of her. I mastered myself and quickly convinced myself it was a play of the light and my mind playing tricks on me. I decided to just go and drop her off, and I was being silly. It was a long drive, and she sat in silence, just looking out the window. I realized that I was driving towards Torrance, where her father's house had been. I checked the map, and sure enough, the drop was a block away at a small park near her dad's house. He had passed away a few years back, and the house had been sold. At that point, I just wanted the ride to end. I was freezing and emotionally holding on by a hair. But still, I convinced myself that this was a different girl, and I was being stupid. She just looked like a younger version of her. We got to the park, and I turned to look at her, but she was out the door, walking into the dark park. She disappeared into the shadows of the trees. I drove to the next gas station and fueled up to go home. My dome light came on, and I checked the back doors. The dome light was working. I checked the Uber app to see if I had imagined the whole thing. It was a real ride. Back at home, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I decided to unblock her on Facebook and see if there were any recent messages. The first thing I saw was an in memoriam post with her name. It was the first time I saw that. Because she was known to lie a lot, that in itself didn't prove anything. It was the messages that got me. She had had a stroke and wanted to talk to me. Then another message a week later. Then all her posts and messages stopped a year before. I still did not believe due to her history of not telling the truth. A month later, I figured out how to confirm her death. The LA County coroner had a website that lists deaths. She was there, died a year before. I believe she was in the car with me that night, but I will never really know. Haunted by that night, I started researching more about the supernatural. I found stories similar to mine, ghosts of the past appearing to those they had unfinished business with. I couldn't help but feel that she was reaching out to me for closure. Maybe she wanted forgiveness, or perhaps she just wanted to say goodbye. I began to feel a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for the life she lost and the demons she couldn't escape, and relief that I had survived that dark period of my life. I decided to visit the park where I had dropped her off. It was a small, quiet place with a few benches and a lot of trees. As I walked through the park, I felt a chill in the air, a sense of presence that I couldn't quite explain. I sat on one of the benches, closed my eyes, and took a deep breath. I whispered into the cold air, hoping she could hear me. "I'm sorry for everything. I hope you found peace." As I opened my eyes, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, and for a moment, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Maybe it was my way of letting go, or maybe she had finally found her peace. Driving back home that night, I felt different. The encounter, whether real or imagined, had changed something inside me. I felt more at peace with my past, more grateful for the life I had built. I continued driving for Uber, but I never went near Skid Row again. The memories were too heavy, and the risk of encountering her ghost once more was something I wasn't ready to face. Life went on, but I always carried that night with me. It served as a reminder of how far I had come and the importance of cherishing the present while making peace with the past. Whether it was truly her ghost or just a figment of my imagination, it didn't matter. What mattered was the closure I felt and the lessons I learned from that haunting ride through Skid Row. Working the graveyard shift as a cop sucks for a myriad of reasons, chief among them being the eeriness of the night. Now, saying that might make me sound like a baby, considering that I'm no small dude, but it's true. Something about being stuck in your car with no human life in sight has an almost alien feeling to it. I'm sure it would help if I lived in an area that wasn't as heavily forested as Wyoming, but as it stands, if there's a light on near me, I almost can't see it with how dense the foliage is. Most nights, there's nothing to do, so it's just me and the silence. I usually take the time to catch up on a show I'm watching or finish a book. On the off chance I do get a call, it's always something small, like a wellness check or a suspicious character outside a bar. I'm always happy to take these calls though, as it gets me back towards populated areas rather than some gravel road where they have me scouting for speeders. It's not an exciting job, but it pays the bills. It happened 2 days ago, on a relatively warm night. I was working my first night shift in a while after getting back from vacation. Jimmy, the officer who replaced me while I was out, told me that he finally understood what I was talking about when I said it was creepy. I chuckled, assuring him that I would take over for a while, and advised him to bring something to do next time to keep his mind off it. If anyone were to understand what the transition from day to night shift was like, it would be me, so I tried to make him comfortable. After all, if he started taking them more, I wouldn't have to sit in the darkness as much. He handed me the keys, and I had an idea. This was the only night shift I was scheduled for that week. Why not make it a little more bearable? I decided to invite him along. He could either sit at a desk all night in a dimly lit precinct with only one other person, or hang out and shoot the shit in the cruiser. Honestly, I don't think the blinding white walls of the station are that much more comforting than the darkness, and I think he agreed, because he accepted the offer pretty quickly. We parked in one of our designated hiding spots and settled in, watching some shitty horror movie and cracking open a few beers. Sure, we shouldn't have been doing that, but who was going to arrest us for it? We weren't small guys either, so it would take more than a couple of beers to get us tipsy. We also didn't expect to be moving much, until my work phone rang. I sighed, rubbed my eyes, and answered it. It was already 3 a.m., so at least we'd made it halfway through the shift before something happened. I immediately heard giggling on the other end. I said hello a few times and was about to hang up when I heard a voice on the other end of the line. It was Brian, the only other officer on duty that night, and he was in charge of manning the station's phone. Usually, he was as monotone as a depressed robot, so to hear him laugh was already weird. "Hey Tom, how's it going?" "I can't complain. Just living the high life with Jimmy here. What's up?" "You're not gonna believe this shit. I got an emergency call from the old AMEC factory on McCaben Road." "How? That place doesn't have any power, or phones even. That's why I'm laughing my ass off. The person who called said they broke into the place to try and steal equipment, and now they're somehow stuck inside." It was silent in the cruiser for a second. Jimmy and I slowly turned to look at each other, and then, almost simultaneously, we burst out laughing. "You're shitting me." "I'm dead serious. When I got the call, I almost pissed myself trying not to laugh at the poor bastard. I'm about to piss myself right now. Hell, I think Jimmy already did." Jimmy jokingly slugged me in the shoulder as Brian began to talk again. "Anyways, do me a favor and go and help the guy get out of there. It's your choice whether you want to arrest him for trespassing or not, but he's had a bad enough night as is, by the sounds of it. We'll take care of it. Beats giving another speeding ticket. I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep a straight face, though. I sure as shit wouldn't be able to. Give me a call back if you need backup, all right? I'll have to call the precinct up in Pinedale if you do. They have their parade this week, so I'm sure they've got a few guys to spare. Sounds good, Brian. We'll keep you posted. I hung up and flicked the cruiser's lights on, piercing through the darkness. We peeled out onto the road, making sure not to hit any deer along the way. It was only about a 10-minute drive, but you never know. We pulled into the bramble-covered entrance to the building, and I got out of the car to undo the rusted chain blocking the road. The place had been abandoned for 10 years after AMEC moved its drilling operations up north and took half the town's population with them. Now, the place was just a drinking spot for local teens, and it showed, with the amount of graffiti sprayed along the sides. We got out of the cruiser, flicked our flashlights on, and started looking for an entrance. Jimmy was noticeably on edge, probably because he didn't know this place existed. He was relatively new to the area, and I'm pretty sure this was his first time having to get out of the car on the night shift, although I didn't ask. He went around the left side of the building, while I took the right, both of us looking for a rusted door or a busted window. I was peeling brambles off of my shorts when I heard Jimmy start yelling. I immediately hightailed it back towards the other side of the building, hand on my holster, preparing for the worst. Was this a trap? Maybe the dude we came here to find was some sicko looking to hurt us, or worse. I sprinted around the corner, shining my flashlight in front of me and expecting the worst. My flashlight illuminated Jimmy, who was doubled over laughing. I was confused and immediately asked if he was all right. He looked up at me with the widest grin I'd ever seen him sporting. "I totally got you." I was relieved that nothing actually happened, but was mostly annoyed that he did that to me. It was almost 4 o'clock in the morning, for God's sake, and we were on the tail of some idiot in the middle of an abandoned warehouse. For a second, I'd thought he was getting attacked and would be lying in a bloody heap by the time I got over to him. I think he saw that I was pissed because his face immediately sank and he started to apologize, saying he was just trying to lighten the mood. I took a deep breath and smiled at him. I assured him that I'd get him back at some point and to just focus on getting in for now. We found a broken window that we assumed he'd climbed in through and shined our flashlights on the floor inside to make sure we weren't about to step on nails or something. As we climbed into the place, I radioed Brian and asked him to call a few other officers over to us, just in case something went wrong. After the shit Jimmy pulled, I was on edge that something bad would actually happen, so I figured it was better to be safe than sorry. The power in the place still didn't work. In hindsight, I have no idea why I even bothered checking. So it looked like we were going to have to put our flashlights to work. We called out a few times into the darkness, seeing if we'd get a response, but to no avail. We walked past the old drills and ore processors, our feet clicking against the concrete floor. After searching the bulk of the main room, we headed for the hallway at the very back of the factory. I knew this place pretty well, since I'd been called there during the daytime a few years back to clear out some drunk partiers who'd snuck in. Still, it was a whole different beast at night, and the fact that the hallway immediately branched into 3 more didn't help. This is where we made our first mistake, and it was a pretty stupid one. We decided to split up. I know, it's how horror movies start, and how characters die, but we were both tired, and our energy drinks were wearing off. We agreed that we'd keep our radios on at all times, and let each other know if we found the guy. At this point, I'd assumed that he'd found his way out and ran into the woods in fear of being arrested, but we still had to sweep the place just in case. I wasn't planning on arresting the guy, as I figured that he'd had a bad enough night at that point, and the old equipment he was planning on taking wasn't of any use to anyone anymore, so I would have let him off with a warning. Now, though, I was starting to change my mind. I didn't want to have to search the entire factory for him. I slowly made my way through the back hallway, taking note of the cracked floor and the chipped drywall. My flashlight was starting to flicker, so I made a note to change the batteries when I got back to the cruiser. That's when I noticed something. A weak light at the very end of the hallway. "Hey, Jimmy, do you see a light at the end of your hall?" Nothing but static. I was on my own. I slowly walked towards the light, keeping my hand on my holster and praying I wouldn't have to use it. As I got closer, I noticed it flickering, and it began to get dimmer and dimmer. I hurried my pace, fearing it would go out by the time I got there. If this was the guy I was searching for, he could run out while I tried to change my flashlight batteries, and I'd be back to square one. I picked up the pace and found myself running by the time I got to the end of the hall. I stopped in front of a door labeled Foreman's Office and gently pushed it open. The smell of dust and mildew immediately hit my nose, and I started to cough. I waved my flashlight around the room, looking for any movement. I saw the source of the light, a cell phone lying face down on the ground. I picked it up and saw that it was cracked beyond repair. This was weird, but what was even weirder was the fact that the screen was still on. Most phones turn off within a few minutes if they aren't in use, so this had to have happened recently. I walked to the back of the office and found a door. I figured it was a closet, so I didn't bother trying the handle. My mistake. I turned back around and radioed Jimmy, telling him I'd found the guy's phone, but was starting to think he'd left the building. I got no response. I sighed and started to walk back towards the hall. That's when I heard a thud behind me. I turned around and pointed my flashlight at the door, but nothing happened. It sounded like it came from inside the closet, but that wouldn't make any sense, right? There's no way the guy would lock himself in a closet with no way out. I took my hand off of my holster and gently grabbed the handle, slowly twisting it to avoid making noise. I quickly pulled the door open, and my flashlight hit the worst sight I'd ever seen. The guy we'd come here to find was a young girl, about 17 or so, and she was lying dead on the closet floor. I won't go into too much detail, but it looked like she'd been strangled, and her hair was matted with blood. I immediately dropped my flashlight and fell backward, scrambling to get to my feet. I began to hyperventilate, my heart beating out of my chest as I tried to process what I'd just seen. As I was fumbling with my radio to call Jimmy, I heard something in the hallway behind me. I turned around, expecting to see him, but was met with a horrifying sight. It was a tall, dark figure, standing perfectly still at the end of the hall. It was too dark to make out any features, but it looked like it was wearing some sort of robe. I froze, unable to move or even speak. The figure just stood there, staring at me. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as it slowly started to move towards me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I turned and ran as fast as I could, not looking back. I could hear footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer. I burst out of the building and ran towards the cruiser, my heart pounding in my ears. I jumped in and locked the doors, grabbing the radio and frantically calling for backup. Jimmy finally responded, saying he was on his way. I watched the entrance to the building, but the figure never came out. When Jimmy arrived, we waited for backup before going back in. They found the girl's body, but there was no sign of the figure. We searched the entire building, but it was as if it had vanished into thin air. The whole incident was written off as a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, but I know what I saw. I can still see that figure in my nightmares, standing at the end of the hallway. When I was 17, my parents were painting my room over the course of a few days, and during that time, I slept on the couch in the living room right next to it. This was on the ground floor of our house, separated from the second by 5 steps with a full staircase up to the third from there. One of those nights, I was falling asleep on the couch with no light other than the screensaver on the computer across the room. Just as I started to slip out of consciousness, I suddenly heard the stairs creak as though somebody stepped and then sat on them over and over. I was too freaked out to open my eyes and see what was happening, but after a few seconds, I heard the door that separated the living room from the hallway that led to my room and the laundry room close by itself. There was plastic on the floor that rustled when this happened, but I didn't hear any footsteps on it. I could see my bedroom light turn on through the crack and heard a few light bangs while the squeaking on the stairs continued. The door opened after a minute or two. I was still too spooked to look. And the light went out, and when it did, the sounds coming from the stairs also ceased. Even though I was terrified, I finally managed to gather the courage to check out what was happening. I leapt up the first staircase and then scaled the second, where I could see and hear the TV playing in my parents' room while the doors to my brother's and my sister's rooms were closed. I tiptoed into my parents' room and found my 11-year-old sister sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at the TV in a trance, not reacting when I walked into the room where she could see me. I called her name, and she turned to me with giant eyes, then asked me what I was doing up there. When I told her what I had heard, she confirmed that she heard the same things and assumed it was me. We both ended up sleeping on the floor and explained the whole thing to our skeptical parents and brother the next morning. Although we never figured out what was going on, it wasn't the last time some inexplicable stuff happened in that house. A few weeks later, another strange incident occurred. I was alone at home after school, trying to finish my homework in the living room. The house was unusually quiet, except for the faint ticking of the clock. Suddenly, I heard a faint humming noise coming from upstairs. It sounded like someone was humming a lullaby. At first, I thought it might be my sister, but then I remembered she was at a friend's house. I decided to investigate, slowly making my way up the stairs. The humming grew louder as I approached the second floor. It seemed to be coming from my parents' room. I pushed the door open and peeked inside, but the room was empty. The humming stopped abruptly, and I was left standing there, feeling a chill run down my spine. I quickly shut the door and ran back downstairs, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. That night, I told my parents about the humming. They laughed it off, saying it was probably the wind or my imagination. My brother teased me, calling me a scaredy cat. But my sister looked worried and whispered to me later that she had heard the humming before too. She said it usually happened when no one else was home. Over the next few months, more strange occurrences followed. Lights would flicker on and off by themselves, doors would creak open and shut, and objects would move from their original places. My family tried to ignore these incidents, but the unsettling feeling persisted. One particularly unnerving night, I was in the kitchen getting a glass of water when I heard a soft, eerie giggle coming from the hallway. It sounded like a child's laugh, but it was distorted, almost otherworldly. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned to look, but no one was there. The giggling stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving me in a tense silence. I decided to set up a few cameras around the house, hoping to catch something on film and prove to my family that I wasn't imagining things. For several days, nothing unusual happened, and I began to doubt my own experiences. But then, one night, as we were all having dinner, the camera in the living room captured something chilling. The footage showed a shadowy figure moving across the room, pausing near the stairs, and then disappearing into the hallway. None of us had been in the living room at that time. When I showed the footage to my family, their reactions varied. My parents were visibly shaken, but tried to maintain a rational stance, suggesting it could have been a trick of the light or a technical glitch. My brother was stunned into silence, and my sister looked genuinely frightened. After that, my parents decided to call in a local paranormal investigator to check out the house. The investigator conducted a thorough examination, using various devices to detect any unusual activity. He concluded that our house did have some form of paranormal presence, though he couldn't determine its nature or intent. Despite the investigator's findings, the strange occurrences didn't stop. They became a part of our daily lives, something we learned to live with. To this day, I still don't know what caused those eerie events, or why they started when they did. All I know is that my childhood home holds secrets that may never be fully understood. I was born in a little town in Canada where it snowed a lot. For this reason, my parents decided to move to a cabin in a forest a few miles away from town. They took me and my siblings, 3 brothers, 2 sisters, and a dog. I, being the second oldest, didn't really like the idea of living in the woods. My parents assured me it would be wonderful, just us out here. It took us about 2 weeks to fully get settled in. One day, as I was playing with my youngest brother, he asked me if I could read him a book. I said, "Sure, buddy. Go ahead and pick one out." His smile could have lit up the entire room. He quickly shuffled over to his bookshelf. Despite being 6 years old, he ignored all the picture books and went straight for a black pop-up book called The Man from the Window. I don't remember ever seeing this book before, but I assumed our mom had gotten it for him. So, I opened it up and began reading. The man from the window is sad. He couldn't find friends, so now he's mad. Late at night, when there is no light, the man from the window will wrap you up tight. No need to scream or fight, because the man from the window has you all right. Be careful when you hear a tap, tap, tap. The pop-ups in this book were disturbing. They showed the man from the window stuffing a child into a bag, reminiscent of how Krampus would do it. My brother seemed to enjoy the book and begged me to read it again. I declined, and just then heard a tapping sound from the window. I crept over, my hair standing up on my neck, and opened the window. It was daytime, and I could see everything. Just then, a snowball hit me in the face. "Stop being a wimp and come have a snowball fight," my brother Justin shouted. I quickly bundled up in winter clothing, and we headed outside. It was already 3 o'clock, so we only had about an hour and a half until sunset. We played until the sun dipped below the trees around 4:45 and then headed inside. After taking off our gear and settling down in the living room, about an hour later, our parents called us in for dinner. Everyone sat down, and our father began to say grace. "Dear Father, please bless this house." Just as he said that, the lights shut off momentarily before coming back on. My father quickly finished, and we began eating. Later, as I lay in bed, I had a hard time falling asleep. My mom assured me it was likely due to the new environment. Outside my window, the tree swayed in the wind, tapping against the glass. I couldn't shake thoughts of the man from the window and how disturbing that book was. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep. I woke up to my oldest brother violently shaking me. "Get up!" he yelled. I ran outside to see what was happening, and there, lying about 2 feet away from our porch, was our dog. Except, it was missing 2 legs and its head. Our dad rushed everyone inside and told us to stay calm. He called a coworker, and they took the dog to bury it. "What happened to Otis?" my brother screamed. After an agonizing wait, my dad returned and explained that a pack of wolves might have attacked Otis while he was outside last night. Everyone accepted this explanation, and an awkward silence filled the dinner table that night. No grace was said, and conversation was minimal. After about 15 minutes, everyone went to bed. I was heartbroken over Otis's death. Maybe I could have heard Otis scratching at the door if I hadn't been so preoccupied with the man from the window, I thought to myself. Eventually, I calmed down, rationalizing that Otis's death was a result of nature. 3 weeks passed since Otis's death, and life seemed to return to normal. We laughed and had fun together. That night, we decided to watch a movie and stayed up late until around 11 p.m. before heading to bed. As I sat there thinking, I heard a tap, tap, tap. At first, I ignored it, but then I heard it again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. I looked towards my window, but saw nothing. I tried to go back to sleep, but then I heard the tapping again, this time in the hallway. I froze, unsure of what to do, feeling terrified. Slowly, I approached my bedroom door and cracked it open. Peering out, I saw a tall, gray figure standing at least 7 feet tall, with a huge, unsettling smile. It was holding a bag filled with something. The figure and I locked eyes for what felt like an eternity before it said, "Once I grow tired of these companions, just as I did with that dog, I'll return for you." I didn't sleep at all that night, hoping it was just a dream, but it wasn't. When I finally mustered the courage to leave my room, there was no one else in the house. I checked all my family members' rooms, finding their doors wide open and their beds looking as though they had just been vacated. I never saw my parents again, nor did I encounter the man from the window. I called my uncle and aunt that day, but they dismissed my story as nonsense. I moved out of that house shortly afterward and now live in Ohio. Whenever I hear a tap, 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 I brace myself for what might come next. In the summer of 2021, I was 16, and being a Mormon in Utah, I would go on yearly young men's camps. Well, this year we were going up to the north side of Bear Lake, closer to Idaho. We were going up for 5 days in July. When we got up there, it felt off, as if I wasn't supposed to be there, though I wrote it off as just being in the mountains and being paranoid. The first thing we did after getting set up was go on a hike. There was a trail that was kind of shaped like a horseshoe. It was very steep and unkempt. It took us until sunset to get back to camp. Once we got back, I realized I left my camera at the highest point of the trail, also being the middle of it, so I decided to go up and grab it. On my own, I didn't tell anyone where I was going. In fact, I told them I was going to the bathroom because I was kind of embarrassed. On the way up the trail, I noticed how quiet it was, not even crickets. My footsteps sounded so loud. Once I got to the place I had left my camera, where it should have been laying on the path, it was hanging from a tree branch directly above the trail. I had to use a long stick to reach it. There was no way I could have put it there. I was, at the time, 5'7", and this branch was at least 8 feet up. I was very on edge at this point. As I was heading back, I felt like I was being watched before hearing a metallic-like noise in the woods up the mountain. For context, the camp was at the base of this mountain, and there was a small plateau with a clearing in the middle. The peak of that trail was in this clearing. Beyond the plateau was just steep forest with nothing in it. There was absolutely no way a car or anything could get up there. It's impossible. And no, it was not an echo. The mountain did not echo that loudly. After hearing this metallic noise, I froze. I could not move. I was too scared. I stood there for what seemed like hours, though it was probably 3 minutes or so. I then saw this huge creature walking towards me. This was no animal. It felt demonic. It was at least 9 feet tall, maybe more, and it had glowing eyes. And this wasn't eye shine, because it was very dark due to the sun being behind the mountains, and it had this dark, thick fur, maybe a dark brown color. At some point, I could move. It was still there, but it was just standing there, slightly hunched over. It was not a human, as it did not have the same proportions. Once I could move, I invoked Jesus' name, and it left. This thing was not an animal. It was a demon. I got back to camp and had dinner. I was only gone 30 minutes, but it felt like hours. I didn't tell anyone about this, as I thought they would think I was lying. The next 2 days, nothing happened. But on the 4th day, when we woke up, all of our food was out and the cooler was open. There were large footprints, like 3 times the size of my feet, and I'm a size 16. This was no man. It was that same thing I saw on the trail. Nothing really else happened on that trip, but ever since I saw that thing, I've fallen into a deep depression. I tried to kill myself in early 2023. I'm okay now, just deeply terrified of those damn eyes. It was like that thing would rip me limb from limb if it got a hold of me. I haven't gone camping since, though I've planned a trip with my great-uncles this year. I feel obligated to since my grandpa died. They have been quite depressed. They were his younger brothers, and he died in May, if you're wondering. And yes, I'm still a Mormon, as I firmly believe our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ saved me that day. I am now an adult and have not lived in this house in over 2 years. I have been through every possible explanation for the things not only I, but friends and family have experienced, and still, I cannot think of any logical reasoning for any of it. My family and I moved states when I was young, and to this house that we ended up staying in owning for about a decade. When we eventually moved to a different house, this place took a long time to sell. A very long time. This ended up being sort of a blessing in disguise, because at one point 2 years ago, we had to move back into the house after a disaster in our new home. Throughout my childhood, I had things happen to me that disturbed me beyond belief. For example, every night, like clockwork, I would hear footsteps on the staircase. My siblings and I all lived upstairs, while our parents resided downstairs. For the longest time, I just thought it was our parents up in the night, coming upstairs to check on us. Maybe they heard somebody still up, because it wasn't uncommon for them to come upstairs if they had. I assumed this for a bit, until I started realizing that these steps up the stairs weren't going to anybody's room. The landing at the top of the stairs was just the hallway that led to bedroom doors, a rather open concept, but each night the footsteps would stop right as they reached the top, outside of my bedroom door. They would walk up, stop, and then walk back down. Now, don't get me wrong, this was a very old house. It's impossible to move in that place without somebody hearing you. For the longest time, I tried to pass it off as an old house, settling, because if you've ever lived in an old house, you know they make some crazy sounds. But the problem with this is because it's a loud house. Footsteps are incredibly distinct. I heard each individual step on each stair. Finally, one night I just couldn't sleep. Many times the footsteps would wake me up in the night, but this time I was already awake. Thinking it was my parents, once they got to the landing and stopped at my door, I decided to go see them and complain that I couldn't fall asleep. But then I opened my door, and I was met with a dark hallway with nobody in it, and everything was still. I was, obviously, spooked, and I shut my door and practically ran back to my bed. Moments later, what did I hear? The footsteps, going downstairs, one stair at a time. I've wondered about sleep paralysis, but the very thing I lacked every time I heard it was paralysis, and even sleep sometimes. The problem is, I was not the only one to hear these footsteps, but I had childhood friends who would stay the night and think my parents were coming up, just to see nobody was there. I was alone in the house one day. We would often do yard work outside as a family on weekends during warm weather, as we had a lot of weeds and other growth, and I had come inside to get a drink. To make this make the most sense to you, I'll say it now that we had already finished the backyard and had moved to the front, so everyone was in the front yard. I was in the kitchen with a window that faces the backyard when I noticed there was a shadow next to mine. I looked out the window to see if somehow somebody was out there, maybe a neighbor, but nobody was there. I felt watched and ran upstairs to my room, feeling like I was being chased, but kids always think somebody's chasing them when they're scared. The bigger issue is when I finally got the courage to leave my room. Walking into that hallway, I heard a voice shout my name directly into my right ear. Believe me or not, but I remember this in vivid detail. Even how the voice sounded, how I felt something against my neck, and the terror I felt as I ran back to my family, who were all still outside and had not come in since I did. Perhaps the most damning evidence for me at this point happened when we had to move back into that house 2+ years back. The reason this is so damning to me is because it finally started happening to my family. I tried for years to get them to understand the things I was experiencing in that house, but none of them ever believed me. I told them everything that had continuously happened to me in that place, but they assumed that because I was a child, I just had an active imagination, even though these occurrences never stopped no matter how old I got. But when we moved back in, my mom began to get freaked out. During the mornings, her and my dad would wake up much earlier than us kids. We all lived upstairs this time around, and most of my older siblings had already moved away. My mom would go into the downstairs bathroom to get ready, and every morning, my dad would eventually follow and tap on the door in the same way every morning in place of knocking, so they wouldn't wake us up. Again, you can hear everything in this house. But this system became a problem, because my mom heard the tapping on the door, said, "Come in," like usual, but got no response. She eventually opened the door, but my dad was not there. He hadn't even come downstairs. He remained asleep in their room. The other instance that she could not find an explanation for in the slightest happened when it was just her, my sibling, and me home. My dad was at work, and we were each in one of the 3 bedrooms upstairs. We had a bigger dog living with us. Important context there. From my perspective, I heard a loud bang on the door to the room my parents were staying in, as if our dog, who had been with my sibling, had been released, and she jumped on the door because that behavior was not uncommon for her. But as I opened my door, my mom and sibling came out at the same time as well, our dog leaving the other room for the first time. My mom had assumed the same thing I did, and that's when we all realized that the door had been slammed from the outside, completely on its own. During this same temporary stay, I was able to capture video evidence of something happening for what I believe is the first time. I was up late, as per usual, in the kitchen downstairs. I was the only person awake, the only person downstairs, and I was the only person to witness this. I was recording a Snapchat video when the loudest bang I had ever heard came from the other room. But at the time, as I heard it on my own, it was so loud, I was convinced lightning had to have struck close outside, because there was genuinely no other explanation for what could have been so deafening. I wish I was exaggerating when I say this sound caused my ears to ring. I watched back the video, and with the normal audio suppression that iPhones have, I realized it sounded like something extremely heavy had fallen in another room downstairs. It's important to me at this point to stress that it so clearly came from downstairs, especially since the bedroom above my head was carpeted, and even if it had come from upstairs, there was no way in hell that sharp of a noise could have come from something falling on the thick carpeted floor. Being older and braver at this point, I went to investigate. I know, I would die first in the horror movie, but I needed for my own sanity to debunk this. My first thought was that maybe my mom's straightening iron or something had fallen from the bathroom sink. That would make sense. Still should not have been that loud, but I wanted to find the source of this sound. I wanted there to be a reason, but I searched the entire first floor far and wide. Nothing had fallen. Nothing was out of place. I brought it up to my family the next day, able to present them with video evidence that this had happened, and none of us could figure out how or why. Even the most stereotypical thing happened years prior, when at one point we found an extremely old picture of a little girl, stuffed away behind a shelf in a closet that we had used for years, and the picture was not ours. It was none of our relatives. Part of me wonders if she had something to do with the things happening there. Any time I have stepped into that house after moving out of it, and before we finally sold it, I have felt nothing but dread. A cold fear used to wash over me, and the hair on my arms and neck stood up. There is still so much more that I have left out. So many things that to this day, I would swear on anything have no other explanation, including a time I'm pretty damn sure possession was involved. I've even wondered about carbon monoxide poisoning, because I'm fully aware that's a problem, especially in older houses. But we had the place checked. We had to have multiple inspections in order to even sell it in the first place, and we had tried numerous times over the years to sell it to no avail, and not once was there a leak. As a child, sure, I didn't try so hard to debunk the things I was experiencing, but when I got older, that's all I tried to do, and never, not once, could I find an explanation for the horror that is that damn house. And since they have now experienced it as well, neither could any of my family members. But the house has been sold. It's somebody else's damn problem now. I can only hope they're faring better than I did. When I was 9 years old, I woke up in bed late at night. The light was off in my room, but the hallway light was on. I currently get sleep paralysis at least once a month, but had never experienced it at this point in my life. I looked into the hallway, and nothing was there. I began to rub my crusty eyes and looked back up to see a tall, blacker-than-black shadow figure. At first, I thought it was my dad and called out to it. It just stared at me and stayed silent. Once again, I called out, "Dad," but it remained silent and very slowly walked to the foot of my bed. One last time, I said "Dad" in a questioning manner. It began to slowly walk up the side of my bed, and I knew then that this thing wasn't my dad. I jumped up and ran to my parents' room, frantically telling my mom to turn the lights on. She took her sweet time in doing so, and I looked towards her bedroom door, only to see the shadow enter her bedroom and start slowly walking towards me. I jumped over my mom onto the other side of the bed, and the light turned on. There was nothing there, nobody at all, and my father was not in bed with her. At this point, I thought maybe I was wrong, and it was my dad, seeing that he wasn't in bed with my mom. But when I asked, my mom said that he got called to work. My dad worked on call at the time and could be called to work at any time. I thought maybe he had just gotten home, but he had not returned from work yet. It was only my mom and me there that night. I lay there, wide awake, my heart pounding in my chest. The room felt cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. I kept staring at the door, expecting the shadow to appear again, but nothing came. My mom, sensing my fear, wrapped her arms around me and tried to soothe me, telling me it was just a bad dream. But I knew it wasn't. The feeling of dread and the sight of that shadow were too real. The next morning, I tried to tell my mom again what had happened, but she dismissed it as a nightmare. She told me I had probably been dreaming, or that my imagination was running wild. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept thinking about the shadow, the way it moved, and the silence that surrounded it. It wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Throughout the day, I felt uneasy. Every shadow seemed to take on a menacing shape. Every creak in the house made my skin crawl. I tried to distract myself with toys and cartoons, but the memory of that night lingered in my mind. As night fell, the fear returned, and I found myself clinging to the idea that my parents were there to protect me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the darkness to creep in. The hallway light was on, but it did little to comfort me. I kept my eyes fixed on the door, praying that the shadow wouldn't return. And then, I saw it again, just a flicker at the edge of my vision. My heart raced as I watched the shadow materialize at the foot of my bed, just like before. I screamed, and my mom rushed in, flicking on the light. The shadow vanished instantly, leaving the room bathed in the harsh glow of the bulb. My mom held me, telling me everything was okay, that it was just my imagination. But I knew it wasn't. The shadow had been real, and it was still out there, somewhere in the darkness. That was the last time I saw the shadow, but the fear never completely left me. I continued to have nightmares and bouts of sleep paralysis, but none were as terrifying as that night. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up, convinced that the shadow is still watching me. The memory of that feeling, of being paralyzed with fear and the sense of something lurking in the dark, remains vivid in my mind. What was it? A figment of a child's imagination? Or something far more sinister? I still don't know. All I know is that the shadow was real, and it changed the way I see the world. The darkness no longer feels safe, and every shadow seems to hide something just out of sight. I've never been able to shake the feeling that whatever was in my room that night is still out there, waiting in the shadows. This happened 2 weeks ago. I went on a camping trip with some families in CA at a campsite called Ice House. I've always been a solo camper, and my siblings and cousins are all in relationships, so I had my tent to myself. This was about 3 days into camping. It was maybe around 10 p.m., 11 p.m.-ish, and everyone was dead asleep. I was just on my phone watching TikTok when I started hearing footsteps around my tent. Thinking it was one of my family members, I said, "Stop that." And then the footsteps stopped. It sounded like literal footsteps. I unzipped my tent window and looked in the direction the steps came from, but no one was there. Personally, I'm not a huge believer in the paranormal or ghosts. I shrugged it off and thought of it as an animal. The next night, everyone was partying and drinking. I went to the forest to take a leak, and from the corner of my eye, I saw someone standing behind me. I quickly turned around, and there was a man standing by a tree. I'd say he was about 10 feet away from me, looking like a hiker with a huge backpack. But it was late at night. I ran, didn't even think about looking back. I ran to my dad, and he grabbed his shotgun. We all went as a group to look for this man. We couldn't find him, so my dad called the ranger the next morning and reported the incident. The ranger's exact words were, "We have had a lot of paranormal activities in this exact area." Chills ran down my spine, but he said he doesn't know if anyone has passed away here or not. We packed up and left for an area where there were people so we'd feel safer. To this day, I still think about whether that was an actual person or a ghost. Overall, this made me a 100% believer. Seeing the face of a ghost is scary because they don't blink. I don't know why, but after this encounter, I can't even sleep well anymore. I guess I'm still spooked about it. So this happened about 6 years ago when I was 20 years old, working my first job at a restaurant as a dishwasher and busboy. It was a Saturday night, and the restaurant had just closed. On the weekends, a coworker and I would stay after hours to clean up the restrooms, kitchen, dining area, and so on. My coworker was in the kitchen, cleaning up the dishes. Instead of helping him, I decided to get a head start on cleaning up the dining area. I put up all the chairs and began to sweep. As I was sweeping, I was listening to my music and moving the tables and sweeping the rugs like I always did. However, I started to feel uneasy, as if someone were watching me. I tried to ignore the feeling and keep working, but it just wouldn't go away. There were 2 tables across from each other at the end of the hall. One table was next to the window facing the boulevard, and the other was near the restrooms, which was table 28. Once I got into a clear view of table 28, things started to get a lot creepier. Out of the corner of my eye, I would see a figure, like a man peeking at me. Whenever I turned to look directly at the table, it seemed like the figure would quickly hide back into the booth. At this point, I was scared out of my mind. I began to sweat and felt an overwhelming sense of dread that I can't even describe. Despite this, I decided to thug it out and continue cleaning up. I guess the spirit, or whatever you want to call it, didn't like that I chose to ignore it. It decided to really make its presence known. Each table in the restaurant had a service button that customers could push to get the attention of the waitstaff. As I was getting closer to table 28, I heard the familiar sound of the service bell. I immediately ran to the cashier's table, where you could see which table was requesting service on a small screen above where the host or hostess would stand. Sure enough, it was table 28. I decided to let my coworker know about what was going on. He was still in the back, cleaning up the kitchen with both headphones on. He saw me come to the back and asked if I had finished. I told him what had happened, and he didn't believe me at first. He even laughed at me. Then I told him to get quiet, and he did. We both heard the service bell going off again. We went to check which table it was, and again, it was table 28. This time, his face changed from laughter to fear as he saw that I was telling the truth. My coworker decided that we should just leave and tell the owner and manager what had happened. I agreed, and we left. The owner laughed and said it was fine. We ended up finishing the cleanup the next morning before we opened. Before this experience, the owner would always joke, asking if we had a visit from the ghost yet. I didn't believe him, thinking he was just messing with us. But it turns out that before the restaurant, the property had been a retirement home where several elderly people had passed away. I guess the spirits of the elderly would often pay a visit. After that, things went back to normal, but it remains by far the scariest thing I have ever experienced. I still get chills when I share the story. I clearly remember that day. It was September 12th, 2022. The morning was crisp and clear, about 9:30 a.m. I was doing my usual Uber job, driving around the city, picking up passengers and dropping them off at their destinations. It was just another day until I got a call to pick up someone named Rick. I arrived at the dentist's office, and there he was, standing outside with his son. They got in the car, and Rick seemed a bit agitated. His son just sat there, rolling his eyes, clearly uninterested in the conversation. Rick proceeded to tell me all about his drama with the dentist. He was clearly distressed. Then he said, "I'm glad you speak English. I've had other Uber drivers that don't speak English. I normally don't take Uber, but my wife can't pick me up. She's always doing something with her friends and never taking care of her business. My daughter lives in New York, or else she would have picked me up." As we drove along, Rick kept rambling on about his life, his frustrations with his new wife, and how this wasn't his first marriage. He went on, and his son didn't say much. I'm assuming he was embarrassed by his father's behavior. The son just sat there, staring out of the window, occasionally glancing at me through the rearview mirror. We finally reached his house. It was a beautiful place, well maintained, with a manicured lawn and an impressive driveway. They both got out of the car, but before the son closed the door, he turned to his father and said, "You are such a jerk." The tone in his voice was sharp, almost bitter. I drove away, feeling a bit uneasy, and noticed a sunglass case in my back seat. I pulled over to check it out, and sure enough, there was a pair of sunglasses inside. I decided to go back and return them. When I arrived at Rick's house, he opened the door. I simply told him, "Hi, Rick. You or your son left your sunglasses in my car." He looked at me with confusion and said, "What son? What are you talking about?" I replied, "I'm sorry, you or the guy that was with you in the car." He answered back, "There was no one in the car with me. What are you talking about?" I got a little agitated and said, "Okay, sir, there was a guy with you in the car, and the sunglasses belong to you or him. That's all I'm saying." He grew really mad and said, "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what game you're playing, but these are my sunglasses, and there was no one in the car with me. I had a stepson. He OD'd 2 years ago. I might have said something on the way here, and you're playing a weird game." At this point, I was extremely frustrated. I thought he was playing some kind of stupid game with me. I've had many riders who would do anything to avoid paying a reward for something they left in the car. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Well, I guess I'm imagining what he said on the way out of my car." He said, "You're a jerk." He looked at me as if he wanted to strike me, his face contorted with rage, but all he said was, "You're the jerk." He slammed the door in my face, and I walked away, feeling a chill down my spine. As I drove away, I still don't know if it was a ghost or not, but I kind of felt that somebody needed to say it to him, to make him confront whatever he was hiding or denying. Full disclosure, this is a true story. I also did not mention a lot of the conversation with him due to its politically inappropriate content. There were things he said that were deeply personal and controversial, things that I felt were better left unsaid. But that moment, that encounter, will stay with me forever. It was as if something beyond our understanding had happened, something that defied logic and reason. Whether it was a ghost or just the weight of his own guilt and past, I'll never know. But it was real, and it was unsettling. These events happened to me between the ages 6 and 9. Everything began when I was visiting my cousin when I was 6 years old. My cousin was a year older than me, and back then, she was very adventurous, so we went into the forest near my school. Everything in the forest went normal, and it was around 1 p.m., so we weren't expecting anything weird to happen. Until we climbed down a small hill, and I slipped to the ground. My cousin came down to help me, but as soon as she got down, a big shadow jumped over us. We both saw and heard it, and swore to each other we didn't lie about it. We knew it couldn't have been an animal, because we were in a small forest surrounded by a city. We ran out of the forest because we were little and got scared easily. 1 year later, I was again with my cousin, and we had come to the conclusion that what we saw was an animal. Again, we decided to go on a little adventure, but this time to a different forest around 2 kilometers away from the last forest. We were looking after an old bunker from the Second World War, which my friends had told me about. But since we were braver than before, we went there at 6 p.m., and it was already getting dark. We looked for the bunker for hours, but decided to split up after looking around for a long time. I had gotten used to this forest already, even though I never saw the bunker. But this time the forest felt different. It felt like I was in a forest far away from the city, and I couldn't recognize anything, even though the sun hadn't fully gone down. I shouted my cousin's name because it was already coming so late we had to go back home, but to no response. I started panicking a little and ran into a random direction until I recognized a rope swing in one of the trees and knew I was close to the forest's edge. I walked along the path until I heard my cousin shouting my name, and I stopped and shouted back. Then she came over a little hill and ran to me. She said she was shouting my name and was irritated that I hadn't responded. I told her I was shouting too, but neither of us heard each other back there. We went back home and didn't think more about what happened. Almost 2 years later, we were back in the forest looking for the bunker we remember when talking about some old memories. This time, we didn't split up and actually found the bunker we looked inside with our flashlight and were disgusted of what we saw. Inside the old bunker, there was old burned candles, a pentagram, and some liquids. We didn't want to stay near the bunker and left fast because we thought someone might come there. Everything was normal until we got to the old rope swing. It was swinging back and forth when we came near it. No one else was there with us, so we took up our pace, knowing we were near home. When we already saw her home, we heard footsteps behind us. We looked behind, but saw nothing. Still, the footsteps were coming towards us until I felt a bump on my shoulder and the footsteps passed us. I looked at my cousin and asked her if she heard the footsteps, and she nodded. I was the most scared I had ever been, and we ran straight to her home and told her mom. But reasonably, she didn't believe us when we told about the footsteps. To this day, I haven't told anyone about these experiences and never thought to connect them together. But now that I'm older, I realized how similar they were to each other. I was in elementary school when we moved into this house in a subdivision. It was a 2-bedroom bungalow, and our home was the 6th to be built. So when we moved there, we only had a few nearby neighbors. At that time, people who would visit us would say they felt something off about the atmosphere, or saw someone who wasn't a family member. This naturally scared me as a kid, and I prayed I wouldn't see or feel those things they told us about. But that wasn't the case. So this is the collection of my encounters at our old house. My mom would always hire a nanny maid when we were kids, but they came and went, so my mom would always interview someone at our house and get to know them. One time, my mom interviewed this woman, and she was with someone else. From what I remember, they didn't live in the city, and they traveled from the province to get there. She said she'd come back later to officially start, and that she just needed to get her clothes. But come nighttime, she didn't come back. My older brother and I were already sleeping with the bedroom door open. I woke up to the sound of someone calling. It was a pissed sound, and it kept on going until I was no longer able to go back to sleep. My heart was pounding because I was paranoid as a kid, and I didn't know who would be making that sound in the middle of the night. I was wondering if it was the maid my mom interviewed, and maybe they had a plan to break into our home, but I was also wondering if it was a ghost or something. I woke my brother up, but he said he didn't hear anything. It felt like that went on forever until it just stopped. I wanted to go check on it, but I was too afraid to get out of bed because I felt like they could see me. I still don't know who that was or what that was. I just tell this story to my family whenever we get to talk about the past. Another encounter that I had in that house was when I was still awake at midnight. But I was older this time. I was still on my phone as a teenager and texting my friends. One of them sent a picture of Valak in our group chat, and that scared the shit out of me. I immediately locked my phone, and when I looked up, I saw 3 women by the door of my bedroom standing and looking at me. That scared me even more. I kept praying for them to go away, and they did. But from that day on, I noticed that these entities would always show themselves to me by the door. I know this is pretty specific, but every time I see something, it's always near the doors of our house. Either they're passing through the door, passing by, or knocking. But there were a lot of them that I saw. There was a kid, a man, and a woman. They are all black entities. Sometimes I'd hear a whisper right into my ear. It's cold and airy, and my family would wonder why I'm shrugging something off, or why I would scream out of the blue. There was one time I was sitting on the floor with my back against the wall, and I felt something moving in my hair. I didn't pay much attention to it, but I felt ticklish. I opened my front camera, and I saw my hair floating as if someone was holding it up. I stood up so fast and tried to process what just happened. These entities were really into me. Maybe because I was the only one in the family who could see them. Sometimes I would still be up late at night, recording videos of me singing, because that was when everything would get quiet, and I would hear a whistle. Like someone is whistling the melody of the song I'm singing. I'll stop singing, and the whistle will stop too. But who would do that? Not a neighbor for sure, because our house was gated and you wouldn't hear sounds coming from our house unless it's loud music. And when I pee at night, I hear the same whistle. It's so long, and it won't stop until I'm done. One time, my dad went home to his hometown. It was 4 hours away from where we lived. They were renting apartments in his hometown, and this one tenant who happened to be a psychic talked to my dad suddenly. She said, "You have a daughter who can see spirits. She has her third eye open." I was so creeped out by that because she didn't know me, and she just came up to my dad to say that. My dad didn't want to tell me, but my mom did, so I could be extra careful because I didn't know what these spirits wanted from me. Anyway, we sold the house and left. One of the factors was that I was experiencing a lot of paranormal activity there, and my parents didn't want that for me. I was relieved until I found out that ghosts don't leave you alone just because you moved houses. They're following you. This experience, or whatever you want to call it, happened when I was a child, around 7, 8 years old. I'll recall what I remember of it. It was around bedtime on a school week, so I left the basement to go upstairs and start to get ready for bed. In my house, the kitchen is to the left of you when you leave the basement. From there, I noticed my mom's back turned to me, packing my lunch for school tomorrow. I remember thinking that was a bit odd, as she usually makes my lunch before she goes to work in the morning, not at night, or she would get me to do it before school in the morning. However, not giving it much more thought, I told her that I was going to go to bed. I don't know why, but I remember vividly that when she turned around to face me, she was wearing a Winnie the Pooh nightgown. I think it may be because I loved this nightgown for some reason. I don't quite remember the short conversation we had. I just remember the feeling. I remember feeling safe, loved, and cherished in her presence, like I usually do, but on a more intense level. After the short conversation, I remember her telling me that I looked tired and should head to bed, and that she would be up in a few minutes to say goodnight. Again, there was an overwhelming feeling of maternal love that was evident throughout her presence. With that, I gave her a hug before turning to go upstairs to my bedroom. When I got upstairs, the bathroom door opened, and I saw my mom again. Only this time, she was not in that nightgown and still in her work clothes. My heart sank, and I just stared at her, trying to wrap my brain around how she got up the stairs before me and went back into her work clothes within the span of me walking up the stairs. My mom asked me what was wrong, and I remember just asking how she got up here before me. She looked at me dumbfounded, saying she had been in the bathroom for a little while now. I told her everything I'd shared with you guys, but all she did was look at me. She reiterated that she wasn't downstairs recently, and that she certainly wasn't making my lunch. That's when we both went downstairs and saw that my lunch was made. I pointed at the lunch saying, see, you made my lunch." That's when she called my dad down to see if he had made it for me, but both of them said no. My mom said I must have made it and forgot. But I never remember making that lunch. I don't think my mom believed me about this entire situation and equated it to an overactive imagination. I still don't understand what happened that night, but I still remember it pretty vividly all these years later, especially the overwhelming feeling that I can only describe as maternal love. I never once felt scared or threatened in the presence of this thing. What could this be? Perhaps I was just imagining it, but I don't know how to explain why the lunch was already made. Maybe I did make it and don't remember it. How is this possible? I still don't understand why I remember it so well all these years later. I want to start this off by stating this happened when I was about 13, so about 21 years ago. I had a best friend who lived fairly close to my home. We shared common ground in aliens and ghost stories. She had once told me about her haunted grandparents' house on their successful local farm. She had heard of haunts, which included noises and guitar riffs sounding from the basement, as well as activity on the second floor of the home in the guest bedrooms. Apparently, her uncle, who had once lived in the basement of the grandparents' house, had gotten into a tragic accident while driving his tractor trailer. Rumor has it that he had a bad heart due to cocaine use and had a heart attack while driving. He had also been robbed after pulling over to call emergency services. Needless to say, he did not die peacefully. My friend had invited me and her 2 twin sisters to clean the 2 upstairs guest bedrooms of the grandparents' house on the farm. We were both very excited about this, as it gave us an opportunity to explore and to possibly witness any ghost sightings. Upon arriving and getting settled, we explored the basement. There were guitars propped up and posters of Metallica as well as Led Zeppelin. No activity in the basement. The 4 of us decided to get started on cleaning the 2 upstairs bedrooms. We made our way upstairs, where there were just steps and a bedroom on the left and one on the right. Her twin sisters started to tackle the bedroom on the left. My best friend and I started to dust and wipe down surfaces in the room. We decided we would assign ourselves. We noticed an attic door. I wedged it open after struggling for a minute. As soon as the door opened, a gust of heat mixed with negative energy made its way into the room. We both looked at each other, creeped out, and I shut the door. After cleaning for about 5 minutes, my friend noticed dirt marks in the shape of large handprints that appeared to be on the walls. They were most definitely not there a minute prior. We both exchanged dumbfounded looks. There's no way that they had been there before. I started to feel very unsettled. A couple of minutes go by, and her twin sisters come into the room that we were in. We explained what was going on. They shot us a look of disbelief and sarcasm and rolled their eyes. Her one twin sister asked us to check her work in the room that she and her sister had tidied up. We all head over to the room and notice something eerie. An adult body print lay on the sheets of the bed that she had just made. Mind you, this bed had no quilt or comforter, just sheets, so the ability to see an imprint of something was more likely. She fluffed the sheet, causing the sheet to appear like it was floating. We all witnessed a smoky cloud of some sort fly into the wall above the bed. Within 2 seconds, the knob on the window air conditioning unit starts to turn, and we jet. I pushed my friend out of the way so I wouldn't have been last going down the steps. My best friend's sisters were first, pushing their way down the steps and screaming for their mother. Needless to say, this was the last visit to that house. My name is James Peterson, but everyone calls me Jamie. I have a deep love for hiking in the mountains, woods, and trails. Sometimes, I venture off the beaten path to fully immerse myself in nature. I know what you're thinking. Why would I go off the trails? That's how horror stories often begin. But there's something about the solitude of the wilderness that draws me in. This time, I was hiking through the Sierra Nevada mountain range, planning a 4-day solo hike. I had mapped out my route and intended to camp near the base of the mountain, starting my hike at dawn to reach my second campsite by the afternoon. The first night was uneventful since I hadn't yet ventured too deep into the mountains. I set up camp, cooked a meal, and prepared for the next day. By 10 o'clock, I settled into my sleeping bag. I awoke early, packed my gear, and set off on the trail. An hour and a half into my hike, I began to hear footsteps behind me. I brushed it off, assuming it was just another hiker. However, as I walked, the sound of rocks and twigs snapping persisted behind me, yet no one ever passed. It was unsettling, but I chose to ignore it and continued on my way. After a few more hours, I reached my campsite and set up my gear to relax and enjoy the sunset. I still waited for whoever had been following me to pass, but they never did. As I prepared dinner, I heard footsteps approaching again. I stopped cooking and turned off the burner, anticipating the arrival of another hiker. To my surprise, an elderly couple walked by, greeting me warmly. "Hello there, young man. How are you?" they asked. I replied, "I'm doing fine, just cooking my dinner. Did you happen to see anyone else on your way here?" The couple exchanged puzzled glances. The old man said, "Sorry, lad, you're the only one we've seen all day." I offered them some snacks for their hike, and they graciously accepted before continuing on their way. The rest of the evening was quiet, but as I finished my meal and watched the sun dip below the horizon, I felt an inexplicable chill. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I quickly turned around, half expecting to see an animal or another hiker. Nothing was there, yet the sensation of being watched lingered throughout the night. As I lay in my tent, clutching a hatchet for comfort, sleep came slowly. I woke early the next morning, determined to make my way back down the mountain. Familiar with the area, I decided to cut through the woods to save time. However, as I hiked, I lost track of the sun's position, and before I knew it, it was already noon. Confused, I glanced at my watch, realizing half the day had slipped away. Losing track of time while hiking isn't unusual, but I had never lost more than an hour before. It felt like driving while zoning out, only to realize you've reached home without remembering the journey. Now, I was officially lost in the Sierra Nevada mountains, with no idea which direction I had come from. To make matters worse, I could hear footsteps behind me. Snap, crunch, snap. Then it went quiet. Determined to find my way, I could still see the sun, indicating east. I chose to keep hiking toward the road, where I knew there was a call box to contact the forest ranger. The faster I moved, the closer the footsteps seemed to get. Panic surged through me as I began to hear a voice, softly asking, "Can you hear me now? Can you see me now?" I didn't want to respond. Fear gripped me. I turned and saw it. A tall figure, its skin dark as the shadows around it. Its eyes glowed like a cat's in the night. Suddenly it yelled, "You can see me! Stop! I won't let you leave! You're mine!" Adrenaline coursed through me, and I ran as fast as I could, the ground shaking with each heavy footfall behind me. I didn't know how long I had been running, but my legs ached and my lungs burned. "Stay with me. Don't leave me. I don't want to be alone," it whispered, its voice haunting. I dared a glance back and saw its contorted face smiling at me, twisting with malevolent joy. It screamed again, "I will get you. You will never leave." Finally, I spotted the road ahead, and as I burst out of the woods, I heard it scream, "No! You were mine!" I looked back one last time, and the figure remained at the tree line, its eyes locked onto me, watching silently as I stumbled toward the bright blue call box a few hundred feet away. After reaching the box, I called the rangers, my hands trembling. As I waited, I could feel its presence lingering in the air. When the ranger truck appeared, I felt a brief moment of relief. Just as I was about to step into the truck, I heard it whisper, "I'll be waiting for you." I'll never forget your face." The ranger drove me to my car, and as we traveled, I couldn't help but ask, "Do you know what just happened out there?" He sighed heavily. "Don't come back. It knows who you are now." Chills ran down my spine. "What is it?" I pressed. He replied, "I don't know, but my trainer and his trainer before him all said to never enter the mountains alone. It follows those who travel solo." I remembered the elderly couple from the previous day, and how their expressions had been more than just confusion. They were worried for me. As I got into my car, the ranger followed me until we were out of the Sierra Nevada National Park. I don't know if anyone will believe me, and honestly, I don't care. But if you ever find yourself in the Sierra Nevada mountains, remember to always bring a partner. If you hear someone walking behind you and they never pass, don't dismiss it. Leave immediately. Something is following you, and you need to get off the trail and out of the woods. So, to preface this, I've never had hallucinations, and the only paranormal experiences I've had been these three to be mentioned. I did have sleep paralysis a lot as a child, but it went away in adolescence. When I was in my early 20s, I was in a dark place mentally, living in an apartment complex alone. After a night of heavy drinking, I passed out on my apartment floor. I had a nightmare in which I was in a room with a black dog, and I was afraid of it. I was resting my head on it like a pillow, and if I tried to move away, it would start to growl at me. At some point, I realized I was dreaming, and I pushed the dog away. Immediately, I woke up, and before me, there rose a shadow person from the floor. It had the outline of a person, but was pitch black, with no discerning features. It moved towards me a step, and moved a hand towards me, and then went away. I was paralyzed, by the way, when I woke up and saw this. As soon as it vanished, I could move again. The second time, a few weeks later, I was sober. I was in bed and woke up paralyzed again. This time, I couldn't see any entity because my head was down maybe, or to the side. I was on my stomach. This time, there was also a constant buzzing noise raising and lowering in pitch. I felt dread and terror. I then felt something crawl on top of me and rest on my back. It seemed to be draining me of energy or something. It felt like it was feeding on me somehow. After probably about 30 seconds of this, it all went away and I could move again. I mostly dismissed all of this as being hallucinations due to sleep paralysis and a poor mental state at the time. Very depressed. But now, a few months ago, I'm 32 now, I had a dream. In the dream, there was a man I didn't know who explained to me that there is an organ in our body which, if strengthened by meditation, can increase emotional connectivity to others. Something along those lines. I was taken to people who were practicing this meditation and chanting. The man told me that the people doing this practice were called Nergal. He then even spelled out the name for me as Nergal, like it was important that I know. Now, I'd never heard this name before in my life. Oh yeah, the creepy thing is that these practitioners, the chanting was like sludgifying them. Some of them had turned completely to sludge and were kept in pans on shelves. Some of them weren't fully dissolved and had appendages sticking out from their respective blobs. Some of them were scared and panickedly saying, "Put me back! Put me back!" I woke up from that dream with a start. The name Nergal echoed in my mind. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to look up the name. I found out that Nergal is an ancient Mesopotamian god of the underworld. This discovery added an unsettling layer to my experiences. It felt like there was a connection between my dreams and something far older and darker than I could comprehend. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered if there was something deeper at play. These weren't just random nightmares or hallucinations. They felt connected, almost like pieces of a puzzle. The shadow person, the black dog, the energy-draining presence, and now the strange dream about Nurgle. All these experiences seemed to point towards something beyond the ordinary. As I delved deeper into my research, I found references to shadow people and their association with sleep paralysis. Many cultures have stories about dark, shadowy figures that appear during episodes of paralysis, often linked to negative energy or spirits. This made me reconsider my earlier dismissal of these events as mere hallucinations. Reflecting on these experiences, I began to wonder if my mental state had made me more susceptible to these encounters. Was my depression and isolation drawing these entities to me, or was it my altered state of consciousness that allowed me to perceive them? The more I pondered, the more questions arose. The dream about Nurgle, in particular, stuck with me. The idea of an organ that could enhance emotional connectivity through meditation intrigued me. Was this a message or warning? The image of the practitioners turning into sludge haunted me. It was as if their pursuit of this emotional connectivity had led to their undoing. I've never experienced anything like this again, but the memories remain vivid. They serve as a reminder that there are things in this world, and perhaps beyond, that we don't fully understand. Whether these experiences were manifestations of my mind or glimpses into a darker reality, they have left an indelible mark on me. These encounters have made me more open to the mysteries of the unknown. They have challenged my perception of reality and pushed me to explore the boundaries of my understanding. While I may never have definitive answers, the journey to uncover the truth continues to shape my perspective and my life. It all took place when I was 8. Me and this girl from my block were playing on her trampoline. We got bored, so we started telling scary stories. Little did I know she had something up her sleeve as she got her older brother, whom I had never met, to dress in a clown costume. As she told me this story, she said, "I had an uncle that went to prison because he killed kids." Next to the trampoline, there was a small alleyway where her brother ran out holding a butter knife. Back then, I thought it was a real knife, so I ran, and he chased me and pretended to run after his sister. When I hid behind a wall and peered, I saw that he was standing over her with blood all over her shirt. I later found out it was fake blood. He looked up and chased after me. I ran and hid behind a building and saw an opening in the fence that connected to the forest. I crawled into the forest and ran behind a bush, waiting and listening for him. I heard him run past. I peeked and watched him look into the forest, and then he ran off to find me, presumably. I looked around and walked deeper into the forest. This was the first time I had ever been in the forest. I made it to a clearing that had wood stumps placed like seats around a fire. I sat down on one of them, sighed, and wiped my forehead, looking around and wondering why this all happened. Suddenly, I heard the brother walking towards me, so I dove headfirst behind a bush. I heard him pass by. I turned around and jumped in shock. There, nestled into the bramble and bush, was a wooden man. The man stood like a soldier at attention. He was smiling. His eyes looked like they were staring at me, but also hollow, like his soul was sucked out. I stood up, Then I heard it. I heard whispers. At first, they were nearly silent. Then they grew. The whispers were of children. Then a deep, manly voice said, "Hey, little girl, it looks like you're not having fun." At first, I thought they were talking to someone else, but the whispers kept talking to me. My voice still scared. I said out loud, "Woo, who's there?" I looked around, terrified. "Oh, you're a boy? Well, that's just as good. You want to play a game?" I looked around. "Who is it? Where are you?" "Why, I'm right in front of you." But in front of me was the wooden man. I looked closely, and it had changed. Its hands were closed, and its eyes wider. It had now spawned a wild look. This made me terrified. "Well," the voice rang out with a hint of playfulness. I looked at the figure, then around me, and said quietly, "No thanks." Then the wind howled, and I heard, "Too bad." Suddenly, the wooden man began shaking before it took a step, and I realized it wasn't made of wood. It was a man. Haven't you heard of the tale? I stood in fear as the man, painted to look like wood, walked closer. Suddenly, the adrenaline of being able to run hit me again, and I bolted out to the clearing. There, I saw the girl and her brother. They were sitting on the wooden stools, bored, waiting for me. When they saw me, they froze. As they saw the man behind me, I immediately hid behind the brother, who raised his butter knife. The man grabbed it from him with ease and pushed him to the ground. The man smiled an unhinged smile before going to grab me. Me and the girl rushed towards the opening of the fence. The girl's brother bolted out with us. As we passed the clearing, we looked back. The man stood still like a statue, but still looking at us. We ran to our respective homes and told our parents, who called the police. The police searched where we said the man was, but there was only the butter knife and a wooden statue of a man standing like a soldier at attention. Now, you wouldn't think it was true if it only happened once when I was that age. When I was 15 last years, I had forgotten what happened, and I went into the forest with one of my close friends. We walked exactly to where the wooden stools were. I sat at the stool while my friend went to pee. Then I heard him scream and rush into the clearing. Behind him was an enclosing shadow that came closer with purpose. It was him. I don't know how, but I recognized him, and I ran with my friend out of the forest. I don't know, but all the memories flooded back into my mind. The same thing happened with the police. They didn't find him. I fear someday he won't be stopping by the fence. Next time a poor soul crosses him. My best friend and I have a long-standing tradition of going out to eat after school. It started back in middle school when we were finally allowed to go to places on our own. We'd talk about everything: his family's quirky antics, our school crushes, the latest drama among our friends. These outings were a special time for us to unwind and connect. Last year, a new cafe opened just down the street from our school. It had a charming, cozy atmosphere with warm lighting, rustic furniture, and the inviting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods. We were excited to try it out and made plans to meet there after school one Friday. As we walked in, the place was bustling with activity. The chatter of other customers, the clinking of dishes, and the hiss of the espresso machine created a lively backdrop. Despite the cheerful environment, I felt a strange sense of unease. It was as if someone was watching us, but I brushed it off, thinking I was just tired from a long week at school. We found a table near the window and sat down. My friend seemed a bit on edge too, shifting in his seat and glancing around. As we started to chat, he suddenly stiffened and gestured subtly toward a corner of the cafe. There, sitting alone, was an elderly woman. Her gaze was fixed on us, her eyes unblinking. When our eyes met, she abruptly turned away and disappeared into the crowd. "Did you see that?" my friend whispered, his voice shaky. "Yeah, that was weird," I replied, trying to shake off the discomfort. We joked nervously about being paranoid, attributing it to our overactive imaginations. However, over the next few weeks, we kept seeing her. At first, it was always at the cafe. She would be sitting alone, watching us intently. Then, we started spotting her in other places we frequented: McDonald's, KFC, the local park. Each time, she would vanish as soon as we noticed her, leaving us with a growing sense of unease. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was just a lonely old woman who happened to frequent the same spots as us. But it was hard to ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. One evening, after a particularly stressful day at school, we decided to unwind at a nearby Burger King. We were relieved not to see her there and finally began to relax. As we enjoyed our meal and laughed about old times, my friend suddenly went pale. "Look up," he whispered. I glanced up at the ceiling and froze. In the ventilation shaft above us, a pair of eyes were staring down. They were cold and unblinking, watching our every move. We quickly gathered our things and left, our nerves on edge. The next few days were tense. We avoided our usual hangouts, sticking to places that felt safer. But the feeling of being watched never completely left us. We couldn't help but glance over our shoulders, our nerves frayed. Weeks passed without any further incidents, and we slowly began to relax. Life started to feel normal again. We returned to our favorite spots, cautiously optimistic that the strange occurrences were behind us. Then, one evening, I was at home alone, catching up on homework. My phone buzzed with a message from my friend. "She's back. Just saw her outside my house." My heart raced as I looked out my own window, half expecting to see her there. The street was empty, but the uneasy feeling remained. I knew then that she hadn't stopped watching us. She had just become better at hiding. Now, every creak in the house, every shadow outside, fills me with dread. I'm always on edge, waiting for those cold, unblinking eyes to appear again. It's a nightmare that we can't seem to escape, a reminder that some things can't be easily explained or ignored. When I was around 7, 8 years old, my cousin was staying the night, and we slept in my bunk bed, him on the bottom, me on the top. It was just peeking into 3 a.m., and we were having a conversation because we liked to stay up as long as we could and just talk. We talked about school, our favorite cartoons, and shared ghost stories that we had heard from our friends. We laughed and tried to scare each other, enjoying the thrill of the eerie night. At one point, I decided to go down and lay in his bed with him so we could talk easier. The creaking of the bunk bed ladder and the rustling of blankets filled the room as I climbed down. After talking for a few minutes, I decided to joke around and say, "Shh, someone is coming. I can hear them. Let's hide under the covers." We both got under, giggling and whispering, feeling the excitement of our little game. Then, all of a sudden, from the middle of my bedroom, granted it's a small room, it sounded like, as I describe it, someone slamming onto my floor with a sledgehammer over and over again. Loud pounding, then loud knocking on the wall behind us. The deck was directly outside my window. and loud knocking on the left wall, which the bed was against. On the other side of the wall was the garage. The room seemed to vibrate with each thud, and our laughter quickly turned into silent terror. This went on for like 5 minutes or so, maybe less. It felt like ages. The noise was so intense, it felt like it was coming from inside the room. I remember mustering up the courage to look, but saw nothing. My cousin and I were frozen, our eyes wide with fear. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, though it was only minutes, straining to hear any further sounds. When it finally stopped, the silence was almost as deafening as the noise had been. Gathering every bit of bravery I had left, I went to my mom, whose room was right next to mine on the other side, freaking out and telling her what happened. She and my dad heard absolutely none of it. My mom checked outside and saw nothing. The deck was empty, the night calm and undisturbed. She went into the basement, which was my older brother's room, and he was asleep, completely oblivious to the chaos we had just experienced. And let's say it was my brother. It was so loud, there's no way my parents wouldn't have woken up. The walls of our house were thin, and even the slightest noise could usually be heard throughout the house. As my mom and I returned to my room, she tried to reassure me, saying it must have been a bad dream, but I knew it wasn't. My cousin and I were both wide awake and heard the same terrifying sounds. We tried to make sense of it, considering every possible explanation: a prank, an animal, even the house settling, but nothing seemed to fit. The experience left us both shaken. I'm 20 now and still have no idea what it was. Nothing paranormal like that ever happened again at that house. Over the years, my cousin and I occasionally brought it up, still unable to explain the incident. It remains a mystery, a chilling memory that lingers in the back of my mind. Even now, I sometimes wonder what really happened that night, and if we were visited by something beyond our understanding. I work for Uber. 3 months ago, I got a request to pick up a man at a hospital. Hospitals often book rides for their patients so we can drive them home. Anyway, I arrived at the hospital and was waiting at the pickup point. I waited for about 5 minutes and decided to call the client to let them know I was there. The phone rang and a lady answered. I asked if the client was ready for pickup. The lady told me, "I'm sorry, the man you are picking up passed away 3 days ago. We forgot to cancel the ride." I told her that was fine and I'd cancel it, but before I could, I heard a voice say, "Take me home." A chill ran down my spine, but I decided to start the ride and continue as if he were in the car. It was a 15-minute drive, and I had this strange, compelling urge to go to that address. On the way, I spoke to him, asking questions as if he were there. I know it sounds crazy, but I heard mumbles in the back seat, though I couldn't understand them. As I drove past a Chick-fil-A, I swear I heard, "I like it there." A sense of joy inexplicably filled the car as we neared his mobile home. We finally got there, and I said, "You're home. Have a great day." I felt a cold breeze as if someone exited the car. As I drove away, the sensor on the car started going off, indicating the back door was open. I parked and checked, only to find the door slightly ajar. I knew it was closed, or the sensor would have alerted me the whole way to his house. This is a true story. It might not seem very scary, but I'll never forget it. I'm 16 years old male, live at home with my mom, her boyfriend, and my sister, 17 years old. My sister is a bit weird. She messes around with witchcraft, tarot cards, crystals, etc. I'm a Christian who views witchcraft as demonic and something which should simply be left alone, and my sister is the polar opposite. Since she started messing around with black magic and things she doesn't understand, strange things have started happening in my house. My mom has been experiencing whispers in the night. I don't know what time these experiences happened, but she heard whispers, which made her shoot up in bed. I've also experienced the same. She never told me her experiences until I told her mine. I was struggling to get to sleep near midnight and felt uneasy. I was trying to sleep and became paranoid. I locked my door and sat on the edge of my bed when suddenly something whispered directly behind me. Its breath was cold and made every hair on my body stand on end. The back of my neck and shoulders shivered where its breath went. It made me shoot up in shock. It was a whisper that lasted a couple of seconds at the most. I couldn't understand what it said, but it sounded female. My mom said she thought the whispers were my sister until she woke up. A female whisper. My dog has also been acting strange, suddenly staring into dark corners of my house, not budging, something which he had never done before. A couple of nights ago, he began growling at a corner of the living room. My dog never growls or barks. These events are very recent and have begun occurring since my sister started messing around with witchcraft. The uneasy feelings and cold whispers shared by me and my mom can't be a coincidence, and my dog's sudden questionable behavior must mean something is in my house. I don't yet know if it's malevolent or not. I'll keep updates on any other events. Update. The whispers and strange occurrences haven't stopped. Last night, I woke up to the sound of soft footsteps outside my door. At first, I thought it was my mom's boyfriend coming to check on us, but when I called out, no one answered. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth. I felt a chill run down my spine and pulled the covers over my head, praying for it to stop. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps finally ceased. My mom has also noticed objects being moved around the house. She mentioned that she left her keys on the kitchen counter before going to bed, but in the morning, they were on the living room table. My sister, of course, denies any involvement and insists that she's careful with her practices. She even suggested that maybe we should cleanse the house with sage, but that idea makes me uncomfortable given my beliefs. Even our electronics have started acting up. The TV turns on by itself, and the lights flicker occasionally, which never happened before. My mom's boyfriend, a practical man, tried to explain it away as electrical issues, but I'm not so sure. My mom and I have agreed to keep an eye on my sister's activities more closely. We're also considering bringing in a priest to bless the house, hoping that it might help dispel whatever presence seems to have settled here. My sister, on the other hand, remains convinced that what she's doing is harmless and continues with her rituals. I'll keep updating as things develop. I'm hoping that whatever is causing these disturbances will leave us alone soon. When I was 4, I became very ill with a high fever. My mama and I were alone in our old house because my papa worked overseas. That night, I could sense my mama was extremely stressed and didn't know what to do. She called my grandparents, who lived nearby, for help. I fell asleep for a few minutes, and when I woke up, I saw my grandparents and some people with them gathered around me. It was a relief seeing them, and I knew there was nothing to fear. I found comfort in knowing that my mother would be pleased to receive a lot of assistance. A few minutes passed, and my grandparents were busy consoling my mom. I was pretty sure it was something about me. I couldn't understand why she was so scared. It was just a fever. All of a sudden, I was bothered by the smell of cigarette smoke coming from the window. I called my mama to stay by my side. I whispered while holding her hand tight, "Mama, please tell the big man to smoke somewhere else. I don't like the smell." Confused, she asked who I was referring to. Pointing in the direction of the window, I described a big, hairy man looking at us from outside, and a small man standing on the windowsill beside him. There was also a small old man with a beard looking at us from another windowsill, and a few tiny men, just the size of my pencil, everywhere, hiding in the closet, in the pile of clothes, on the bookshelves, inside my bag, and on top of the cabinet. I could see their eyes glaring through the cracks and holes from where they were hiding. Behind the small, old bearded man, the head of his horse, as big as the window pane, peeked through the window. My mama, with a panicked look on her face, hastily picked me up and ran downstairs with my equally confused grandparents. I was already an adult when I remembered and asked my mama if she recalled that event. Completely shocked by my recollection of that memory, considering that I was just 4 years old when that happened, she started telling me how scared she was when I kept on uttering gibberish words and pointing to every corner of the room as if some other people were there. Both my husband and I are spiritually aware, and when we bought this giant house in a small town, we immediately felt it was haunted. I sensed demonic energy, but my husband thought it was just ghostly and said he didn't care if it was demonic. He'd take care of it. The house was in poor condition and had been sitting empty for 2 years after the previous owner died in a car wreck. The house had a history of unexplained fires, prompting the previous owner to install fire detectors in every room. The house was originally a cabin and had been built onto over the last 200 years. It had last been used as a rental, and the small town had plenty to say about it. The neighbors confirmed it was definitely haunted, but claimed the ghost had disappeared after the last fire. Despite their assurances, we knew something was still there. We began the process of fixing it up, and with no electricity or utilities on, strange things started happening. While sitting with the contractors, the fan suddenly started spinning rapidly about 10 times before stopping. We all paused mid-conversation, and the contractors, who were in the middle of telling us about a guy in town who owns a train, stared at us in disbelief. We all confirmed what we had just seen and exchanged uneasy glances. Last night, my husband was working alone in the house. His keys, usually tucked in his pocket on a lanyard, were suddenly jerked out as he was packing up. Then he heard a voice directly behind him say, "Stay." He picked up his keys and called me on his way home to tell me what had happened. Another time, while I was painting one of the upstairs bedrooms, I felt a cold breeze brush past me, even though all the windows were shut tight. I shrugged it off until I heard faint whispers coming from the attic. Mustering up the courage, I climbed the ladder to the attic, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The whispers stopped as soon as I reached the top. A few days later, we found an old journal tucked away in a dusty corner of the attic. It belonged to a previous owner from the early 1900s. The entries spoke of strange occurrences in the house, objects moving on their own, doors slamming shut, and the feeling of being watched. One entry detailed a fire that started inexplicably in the middle of the night, eerily similar to the fires we had heard about. We also learned from the journal that the original cabin had been built on land with a dark history. It was said to be cursed by a local tribe after a violent dispute with early settlers. This added another layer to our already mounting unease. As we continued renovations, the strange events persisted. Tools would disappear and reappear in different rooms. Lights that shouldn't have been working would flicker on and off. One night, we heard footsteps on the creaky wooden floors, even though we were both in bed. Despite all this, we're determined to make this house our home. We've started documenting the events and reached out to a local historian to learn more about the house's past. We even contacted a paranormal investigator to help us understand what we're dealing with. Every day brings a new challenge and a new mystery, but we're facing it together. We know whatever it is still there, and while it's unsettling, we're not ready to give up on our dream house just yet.